Secretary of Defense seized a veteran mother's home until 300 soldiers delivered justice at dawn. No one imagined that justice could rise from silence. When government officials arrived at dawn to seize her home, Sarah Whitmore, a decorated veteran and single mother, didn't shout, didn't beg, didn't fight. She simply stood in the doorway as the Secretary of Defense himself declared her property reclaimed for national use. Cameras captured her calm defiance, but what they couldn't see was a storm that would awaken across the nation. What followed wasn't just an act of rebellion. It was a reminder of what honor means when power forgets. 300 soldiers, bound by conscience rather than command, would soon march toward her small house, not with weapons, but with loyalty. And when the sun rose over that silent street, the most powerful man in the military would find himself kneeling before the woman he tried to erase. If stories of courage and truth move you, don't scroll away. Subscribe, leave a comment, and stay until the end. You're about to witness how one mother's quiet strength became the loudest act of justice the world had ever seen. The morning began with the sound of tires over gravel and a metallic knock that broke the quiet rhythm of Sarah Whitmore's kitchen. She looked to the curtain and froze. 3 government SUVs stood by her mailbox, flags fluttering on their antennas. Men in dark suits spread documents on the hood. For a moment, she thought it was a mistake. Then she saw the seal of the Department of Defense stamped across the papers. Her heartbeat quickened. This was no mistake. It was an order. Outside, Secretary Charles Drayton stepped out in polished boots and a cold smile, speaking to cameras about reclamation of neglected assets. He pointed at Sarah's small house as if it were a number in a ledger. She walked toward him with trembling dignity, holding a frame that contained her husband's photo and her own medal from Afghanistan. "This house is not abandoned," she said softly. "It's sacred." He didn't look at her. "Orders are orders," he replied, signing the eviction with a pen that gleamed like a weapon. 2 soldiers, not by choice but by command, carried her belongings to curb. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, afraid to interfere. The wind scattered old photographs across the street. Birthdays, deployments, homecomings. One picture landed at Drayton's feet. A younger Sarah in uniform, saluting a fallen flag. For the first time, he hesitated, then kicked the photo aside. That small cruelty told everyone who he truly was. When the news aired that evening, anchors called it a necessary action. Yet the camera caught Sarah standing still amid the wreckage, eyes unbroken. Social networks exploded with the image of a veteran mother betrayed by her own nation. Why would the secretary personally sign an eviction against a widow? One reporter asked live on air. The question hung unanswered, feeding a quiet fury that spread faster than any headline. That night, Sarah sat by candlelight among cardboard boxes. Her son slept beside her, clutching his father's dog tag. She opened an old notebook and began to write, not to complain, but to remind. Every word was deliberate, carrying the weight of the soldier's promise that loyalty must never serve arrogance. She sealed the letter with her military insignia and wrote on the envelope, "To whoever still remembers what honor means." At dawn, she walked a nearby base and asked for a young officer. Mason Carter appeared, disciplined, kind-eyed, unsure why a woman with sunken cheeks and steady posture addressed him as a lieutenant. She handed him the letter. "Read it if you want," she said, "but make sure it reaches someone who'll listen." Her tone carried the gravity of command, even in defeat. Mason saluted instinctively. Something in her presence felt like history calling. As Sarah walked away from the gate, the sky began to brighten, brushing the horizon with the faintest gold. The world had taken everything from her but one thing, the truth. And the truth, once written, has a way of marching on its own. Mason watched the silhouette disappear down the road, the envelope still warm in his hands. He didn't know it yet, but the letter he held would ignite the conscience of an entire army. Mason Carter stared at the envelope long after Sarah had vanished beyond the base gates. The name Whitmore stirred something vague in his memory, like an echo from a war story told by older soldiers. He slipped the letter into his jacket, intending to deliver it through official channels. But curiosity gnawed at him. Late that night, under the dim light of his barracks, he broke the seal. Inside were 4 handwritten pages, each line steady and sharp, like commands written from a heart. The first sentence hit him like gunfire. "We fought for freedom, not for fear." He read in silence as her words unfolded a truth heavier than metals. She wrote of brothers lost, of promises made, of an army that once protected the weak but now bowed to politics. She didn't name Drayton, yet every sentence carried his shadow. Mason's hands trembled. This wasn't a complaint. It was a mirror held up to the entire system. When he finished, he whispered, "She's right." But soldiers weren't supposed to say that aloud. He folded the letter carefully, feeling the weight of duty shift inside him. The next morning, Mason showed the letter to Sergeant Lewis, a grizzled veteran who had fought in Sarah's unit years ago. The old man read only half a page before tears blurred his eyes. "I remember her," he murmured. "She dragged 3 of us out of the fire when the enemy had us pinned." His voice cracked with emotion. Within hours, the letter had passed through hands that had known both Sarah and the kind of loyalty that never dies. By nightfall, copies had begun circulating quietly through mess halls, training yards, and barracks. At first, it was whispered like rumor. Then it became a spark. Soldiers who had long kept their heads down began reading those words out loud after lights out. They read lines that questioned blind obedience, that reminded them of the oath to defend people, not power. "If you obey every order without asking who it serves," one line said, "you stop being a soldier and start being a shadow." Those words cut deep, for men and women molded to follow. The letter felt like oxygen in a suffocating room. Colonel Avery Ross heard about the letter through a nervous aide. He demanded to see it himself, curious why morale seemed strangely unified for the first time in years. When he opened the envelope and saw Sarah Whitmore's signature, his breath stopped. "She's alive," he muttered. He remembered the burning convoy, the explosion, the moment her hand had pulled him out of the wreckage. For 20 years, he had believed her dead. Now, her words returned like a ghost, commanding him once again, but this time from the other side of the system. Avery ordered the letter read aloud in the officers' mess that evening. Some protested. Others listened in silence. The room was heavy with the weight of conscience. "This is mutiny." One major hissed. Avery replied, "No, this is memory." The young soldiers looked between their leaders, unsure which loyalty mattered more, the chain of command or the call of honor. In that moment, the military line between obedience and morality began to blur, and no one could erase what had been read aloud. That night, Mason faced his own crossroad. His phone buzzed with a message from the base communications officer. "Destroy the document immediately." Direct order. He stared at the screen, then at the letter lying open on his bed. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was a living truth. He could obey the order and keep his career safe, or send the letter to every unit across the country. "Orders are orders," he whispered, echoing Drayton's words. Then he tore that sentence apart in his mind and hit send. Within hours, the letter reached hundreds of inboxes. Officers, medics, pilots, infantry. Each line spread like a pulse through the military's veins. By midnight, soldiers in distant posts were printing copies, pinning them on bulletin boards, reading them under the pale glow of floodlights. The air was thick with something the Army had forgotten: belief. Mason knew there was no turning back. He had lit a fuse that would either destroy him or redeem them all. Days passed, and the letter no longer belonged to one soldier. It belonged to the conscience of an entire force. Military forums were flooded with quotes from it. Some officers deleted posts in fear. Others quietly reposted them. The words "remember who you serve" appeared painted on walls outside bases at night. The Pentagon denied the letter's existence, but denial only made it spread faster. Each repost felt like a heartbeat, defying silence. Mason watched it all unfold, knowing his fingerprint was on every copy. Meanwhile, Sarah lived in a motel outside the city, her few belongings stacked neatly beside the bed. Her son, Ethan, drew pictures of tanks and eagles, unaware of the storm his mother had unleashed. Late one night, she saw her own name on the news. Anonymous letter from veteran mother sparks unrest. The anchor said. Sarah turned off the TV. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper. For the first time since the eviction, she felt seen. But being seen came with danger. Power hates witnesses. Colonel Avery received a discreet summons to Washington. Drayton wanted to discuss morale issues. The tone of the memo chilled him. When Avery entered the office, Drayton was waiting, arms folded. "You know about the letter," Drayton said flatly. "I know about the truth," Avery replied. The secretary's eyes hardened. "Truth doesn't win wars, Colonel. Obedience does." That single line exposed everything wrong with the system. Avery left without saluting. Outside, he texted Mason, "We need to be ready. Something's coming." As the message spread, soldiers began arriving in Sarah's town. Some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, claiming vacation or family visits. They met quietly in diners, at gas stations, in empty lots. There were no speeches, no banners, just understanding. They didn't come to fight. They came to stand. Each carried a copy of her letter folded inside their jackets like a secret oath. Rumors whispered that at sunrise, they would gather in one place. No one knew who gave the order. Maybe no one had to. Sarah's calm life shattered again when 2 social service officers arrived with paperwork from the Defense Department. "Temporary custody for the boy," they said, "until housing is resolved." She tried to protest, but the law spoke louder than grief. As the car drove away with Ethan crying in the back seat, Sarah fell to her knees on the curb. The same nation she had defended was now taking her child. But grief has a way of turning into something unbreakable. She stood again, her eyes hollow, her spirit lit like fire. That night, Colonel Avery gathered trusted officers in his home. "The secretary wants to make an example of her," he said. "Then we make an example of what honor looks like." Some hesitated, fearing charges of insubordination. "They can court-martial my rank," Avery said, "but not my soul." Mason spoke next. "Tomorrow at dawn we stand. No words, no violence, just presence." The plan was born in silence, but it carried the weight of generations who had bled for ideals now forgotten. By midnight, the highway leading to Sarah's old neighborhood filled with unmarked vehicles. Soldiers from across states drove through the night, headlights off, guided by nothing but conviction. Some came alone, others in small convoys. No one asked who commanded them. They simply knew where to go. The air felt heavier, as if history itself were holding its breath. In that collective hush, a single truth bound them together. Justice would not wait for permission. At dawn's edge, Mason parked across from Sarah's house. The first light touched the roof as more cars arrived, then more and more, until the street became a living wall of silence. Sarah stepped outside barefoot, clutching her husband's medal. She looked around in disbelief as the quiet grew thick and sacred. 300 soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, facing her home. No chants, no weapons, only stillness. The storm had arrived, but it came in peace. The sun had not yet risen when the silence became heavier than sound itself. 300 soldiers stood across the small suburban street, their breath misting in the cold morning air. No orders had been given, yet every man and woman held their ground as if bound by a sacred command. Mason stood at the front line, his uniform immaculate, the folded letter tucked in his chest pocket like a medal of faith. Across from them stood Sarah's house, its windows broken, its walls marked with the symbols of bureaucratic greed. Today, those walls were about to speak louder than any speech. From the distance came the growl of engines. Black vehicles turned the corner, headlights slicing through the dawn haze. Secretary Drayton arrived, flanked by armed security, confusion spreading across his face as he saw the ranks before him. "Who authorized this?" he shouted. No one answered. His command echoed and vanished into the still air. Mason stepped forward, saluting with slow precision, not in obedience but in honor. Behind him, 300 hands rose to their brows in silent unity, a salute that belonged not to him, but to Sarah. Drayton's anger flared. "Disperse immediately. You're violating federal protocol." But no one moved. He turned to Colonel Avery, who stood calmly near the front. "Colonel Ross, this is treason." Avery's voice was steady. "No, sir, this is remembrance." The tension thickened as Drayton's guards gripped their weapons. "Stand down. Avery ordered sharply. His tone carried authority older than rank. It carried truth. The guards hesitated, eyes darting between the secretary and the soldiers who refused to lower their gaze. Power was shifting in silence. Sarah watched from her porch, her heart trembling at the sight. The soldiers were not there to fight. They were there to restore what had been stolen. She stepped forward barefoot, the morning light touching her gray-streaked hair. In her hands, she held the flag that once covered her husband's coffin. As she unfolded it, the soldiers stood straighter, the cloth fluttering like a heartbeat in the cold air. The secretary's jaw clenched. He had spent years controlling headlines, but he could not command reverence. Camera crews began to arrive, drawn by reports of a rogue formation. Reporters whispered into microphones, unsure what they were witnessing. A female journalist turned her lens toward Sarah and asked softly, "What do you call this, ma'am?" Sarah replied without hesitation, "This is loyalty remembering itself." Her voice carried across the crowd, calm and unbroken. In that moment, the protest ceased to be defiance. It became testimony. Drayton's eyes darted to the cameras. For the first time, he looked smaller than the story. The secretary tried to salvage authority. "If you do not stand down, you will be discharged," he barked. Colonel Avery walked toward him, stopping inches away. "You can discharge a soldier," he said quietly, "but you can't discharge conscience." The words hit like artillery. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mason reached into his pocket and unfolded Sarah's letter. "Sir," he said firmly, "this is the order we follow." He read aloud a single line. "The greatest honor is not in following commands, but in standing for what's right when commands go wrong." A hush swept the field. The sun finally broke the horizon, flooding the scene with gold. Drayton shielded his eyes as if the light itself accused him. Sarah raised a flag high, and every soldier knelt, not in rebellion, but in reverence. The sound of hundreds of knees touching the pavement created a rhythm like thunder. The image froze time. One woman, one flag, 300 soldiers, and a Secretary of Defense standing powerless before the truth he tried to silence. For the first time, authority bowed before morality. Reporters broadcasted the event live. Across the nation, televisions flickered with the sight of soldiers kneeling before a single veteran mother. The message transcended politics. It became human. Crowds began gathering outside bases, holding signs with one phrase repeated endlessly: "Justice at dawn." Drayton's phone buzzed with calls from Washington, but he ignored them. His world, built on control, was collapsing under the weight of a simple gesture. He realized too late that silence can be the loudest rebellion of all. The moment the sun crested the horizon, the air felt charged, almost sacred. Secretary Drayton's phone rang endlessly, the screen flashing with calls from Washington. He silenced it and stepped forward, his face pale beneath the morning light. Cameras zoomed in as he tried to speak, but the words refused to leave his throat. He had commanded armies, signed wars into existence. But in front of 300 silent soldiers and a mother holding a flag, his authority dissolved like mist. He realized too late that this was a judgment he could never outrank. Colonel Avery approached, saluting briefly before holding out a folder. "Evidence, sir," he said. "Signed orders authorizing illegal seizures under your name." Drayton's hand twitched, but didn't reach for it. The cameras caught every movement, every tremor. "You think you can embarrass me?" he hissed quietly. Avery's eyes were calm. "You did that yourself." Mason stood nearby, watching the man who had treated their oaths like paper currency. "This isn't mutiny," Mason said, voice steady. "It's memory coming to collect its debt." Drayton tried to reclaim control. "All of you, return to your posts," he barked. But his voice cracked mid-sentence and no one moved. The sound of silence was crushing. He turned towards Sarah, desperation rising. "You think this makes you right?" She looked back at him, unshaken. "No," she said softly. "It reminds you that you were wrong." Her voice cut sharper than any order. For the first time, the nation saw power exposed, not by violence, but by truth spoken without fear. The media swarmed closer, recording the confrontation from every angle. Headlines exploded across screens within minutes. Secretary faces revolt of conscience. Drayton's aides begged him to leave, but his pride anchored him in place. Sarah stepped forward, carrying the folded flag. "This isn't yours to destroy," she said, placing it gently in his hands. "It's yours to protect. You just forgot how." That act, offering the flag, turned humiliation into revelation. For a fleeting moment, Drayton's eyes flickered with something human. Shame. Behind the soldiers, citizens began gathering silently along the sidewalks. Veterans in old uniforms, mothers with children, people holding photos of loved ones lost in wars they no longer understood. The sound of quiet weeping spread, like wind through grass. Sarah looked around at them, her voice steady, but filled with tears. "Justice isn't revenge," she said. "It's remembering who we are." The crowd responded with silence deeper than applause. It was respect, the kind that can't be ordered, only earned. Drayton finally lowered his head. The cameras caught it. The most powerful man in the defense chain, bowing before the woman he had tried to erase. He whispered something no microphone caught. Some say it was "forgive me." Whether true or not, the image told its own story. Colonel Avery stepped forward and handed Sarah the keys to her home. The moment felt biblical, a restoration not of property but of dignity. Mason saluted her again, this time as a symbol of everything the uniform once meant. Helicopters circled above, filming the sea of kneeling soldiers and the single figure of a woman standing tall in the center. The footage spread instantly across every channel, across continents. Within hours, protests erupted demanding Drayton's resignation. But Sarah was already gone, walking slowly toward her porch with Ethan's toy soldier in hand. She didn't look back at the crowd. Her victory didn't need celebration. It needed peace. The world could have its spectacle. She had her home. As the crowd dispersed and dawn turned to daylight, a final image remained. Drayton kneeling alone on the pavement, the flag folded in his hands. No one ordered him to do it. He simply stayed there, surrounded by silence, as if trying to understand the weight of what he'd lost. For once, the camera stopped rolling, not out of censorship, but reverence. Power had finally bowed, and in that quiet surrender, a nation rediscovered the sound of its own heart. The street was empty again by the time the sun climbed fully above the rooftops. Reporters had left. Soldiers had returned to their bases, and the noise of engines faded into a hum of distant normalcy. Yet something remained in the air, a reverence that no headline could contain. Sarah stood alone in front of her house, the door half open, the light pouring through as if the dawn itself were blessing her return. For the first time in months, she crossed the threshold without fear. Each creak of the floorboards felt like the heartbeat of a home resurrected. Inside, dust shimmered through the light. She walked to the wall where her husband's portrait once hung and placed it back in its frame. Beneath it, she set his medals, not as decoration but as reminders of promises kept. Ethan rushed into her arms, released from state custody hours earlier. "Are we safe now, Mom?" he whispered. She knelt, cupping his face. "We're home," she said. Simple words, but they carried the weight of every oath broken and remade. Across the country, the footage of that morning played on loop. Commentators debated motives. Politicians issued statements. But the people saw something beyond politics. They saw decency, standing barefoot before power, and power finally kneeling back. Hashtags flooded screens. Hashtag justice at dawn. Hashtag honor returns. In veterans' halls and military academies, the letter was read aloud as a new kind of creed. What had begun as defiance had become doctrine, a quiet revolution of conscience. In Washington, Drayton submitted his resignation under personal reasons. His signature looked smaller than it once had. Reporters caught him leaving the Pentagon at dusk, surrounded by silence, no convoy, no salute. In his briefcase lay Sarah's letter, now worn from being read and reread. Some said he disappeared from public life. Others claimed he began visiting veterans' shelters anonymously. Redemption, after all, doesn't need cameras. It only needs surrender. Colonel Avery received official reprimand but refused reinstatement. "My record is written in better ink," he told the inquiry board. Mason, demoted for insubordination, smiled when he heard the verdict. "Worth it," he whispered. Months later, he received a handwritten note from Sarah. You reminded them what loyalty looks like when it costs something. He framed it on his desk, the same way soldiers frame commendations. Only this one was written in truth instead of authority. Sarah spent her evenings tending the small garden behind the house. The neighbors who once had behind curtains now stopped to greet her, some bringing tools, others just gratitude. One veteran left a single rose on her fence every morning without a note. Ethan played in the yard again, his laughter echoing to the same air that had once carried fear. The world hadn't changed overnight, but her corner of it had, and that was enough to start something lasting. On the anniversary of the protest, hundreds of soldiers returned to the town, this time invited. There were no speeches or parades. They simply stood in silence as Sarah raised the flag again, its fabric glowing gold in the morning light. The crowd watched without applause. Some cried, others saluted. A drone camera captured the moment from above. The same street where the nation's conscience had awakened now stood in peace, unguarded yet stronger than ever. As the flag reached the top, Sarah whispered to Ethan, "Listen." The boy frowned. "I don't hear anything." She smiled. "Exactly." The silence was pure, not from fear, but fulfillment. It was the kind of silence that comes when justice has spoken loud enough to be heard forever. Above them, the flag rippled in the dawn breeze, its sound soft yet eternal, like breath returning to a body once thought lifeless. And as the camera pulled back for the final shot, the sun flooded the town with light. A voice overread the last line of her letter. When soldiers defend the truth, even silence can roar louder than any war. The screen faded to black, leaving behind the echo of that truth. A reminder that courage isn't born from orders, but from the heart that dares to remember. If this story moved you, don't let its message fade. Subscribe for more true-to-spirit stories where courage stands against corruption. Leave a comment with what justice at dawn means to you. And share this video so others remember that silence, when filled with truth, can change the world. More stories like this are on the way. Stay with us for the next revelation that will restore your faith in humanity.